Around 2013, a small indie company going under the name of Compulsion Games released their first game. Titled Contrast, the game was a puzzle platformer, and upon release received meh reviews. It wasn't really liked, but it wasn't really hated either. The game wasn't a flop, but at the same time, it wasn't really a commercial success. It made a profit, though, which allowed them to continue their company. With this, they would begin work on their new project, one that would be a lot more ambitious, for better and for worse. This game was to be called We Happy Few. I went to keep this part brief since I don't really want to make a video that focuses on the game's history or what went wrong and all of that, so I'll just skim through it. Around 2015, the game began as a Kickstarter project. Originally, it was marketed as a survival roguelike with a procedurally generated map. However, during development, the team realized players wanted a more narrative-driven experience. They wanted to explore the world of Wellington Wells. Which, speaking of, see? Told you I'd keep it short. We Happy Few is a relatively original game, but it's clear that most of this development effort went into the world rather than the gameplay. The game is aware of this and never really tries to extend what it's capable of, which, in this example is both good and bad. The setting is Wellington Wells, a dystopian, isolated British town in the 1960s. After World War II, the citizens known as Wellies were left devastated by the fact that they had to give up their own children to the Germans in order to survive. Overwhelmed with the guilt and despair that would come with such a thing, the town's brightest minds came together to develop a miracle drug called joy to suppress these feelings. This is the game's biggest element by far. Every Wellie is mandated to take their joy. If you aren't on your joy, you're a reminder of reality, which makes the others sad. And you wouldn't want them to be sad, would you? Those who refuse their joy are labeled as wastrels. Wellies are instructed to shun them and report them to the nearest authority, usually the bobbies. These bobbies will then exile them to the Garden District along with the other undesirables. When you take joy, the world is colorful, bright, cheerful. You wouldn't ever want to leave. Unless you're one of the three protagonists. Arthur Hastings is the first playable character. He works as a redactor in the Department of Archives, where his job is to censor any news that isn't happy or cheerful. Arthur isn't a hero. He's not even particularly brave. He's just an ordinary man who finds himself in way over his head. The world is divided into different sections, and Arthur lives in the comfortable, cushy, upper-class parade district. A reoccurring theme in We Happy Few is that none of the main characters are particularly good people. They all have their own significant flaws that the game makes sure to emphasize. Arthur's greatest flaws are his selfishness and cowardice. When the children were being sent to Germany, Arthur, who was at the time under 13, was supposed to go as well. His older brother, Percy, was not, as he was over the age limit. Percy, who is autistic, relied heavily on Arthur, despite being older. They were inseparable, and they planned to board the train together and look after each other. But just at the last moment, Arthur swapped their passports, giving Percy's to the officer. This led them to believe that Percy was 11 and Arthur was 13, meaning Percy was sent away while Arthur stayed behind. Once Joy came along, Arthur forgot about this betrayal, until he came along an old newspaper reading Hastings Brothers wins scrap gathering prize. This triggers his memories and makes him realize just how much Joy has taken away from him. He forgot his brother. How could he? Sally Boyle is the second playable character. She's a chemist, primarily responsible for producing Blackberry Joy, a special version of Joy. Because of this, she holds a high status in her general area, especially among the bobbies and drug addicts who rely on her supply. But, like everyone else, Sally has her secrets, and hers is a particularly massive one. She has a child. I know that doesn't sound like a big deal. Thousands of children are born every day. But in Wellington Wells, children are flat out outlawed. Not because they're annoying or noisy or whiny, but because they're a painful reminder of the children that the Wellies once sent away. If the town finds out about Sally's daughter, Gwen, they'll likely chase her out, or worse, kill her and the child. Sally's biggest flaws are her selfishness and her manipulation. She'll constantly persuade others to act in her best interest, using her charm, status, and appearance to get whatever she wants. Her past is filled with broken relationships, especially with her mother. As a child, Sally showed a keen interest in science, something considered a man's profession at the time. This created a massive rift between her and her mother. The relationship ended when her mother poisoned their entire family, attempting to spare her 2 children from being sent to Germany. Sally, as the sole survivor, was taken in by the Hastings family, where she eventually met Arthur, and became best friends with him. Ollie Starkey is the third and final playable character, and easily the most insane. A former soldier, Ollie was a skilled fighter, but when the war was lost, he had to return to Wellington Wells, trying to live a normal life until the day the children were sent away. The night they were sent away, Ollie was drinking at the bar, where he got into a fight with Jack Worthing, a well-known radio host at the time. Jack let it slip that he was hiding his daughter, Margaret, to keep her from being taken. Fueled by his anger and his spite for Jack, Ollie reported her to the Germans. But instead of taking her to the train, they shot her. Horrified by what he had done, Ollie drove himself insane, his mind twisting the events, making himself believe that Margaret was his daughter and that Jack betrayed her. When Joy was introduced, it only made things worse. He started hallucinating Margaret, seeing her as his voice of reason, his anchor. Meanwhile, Jack Worthing became the face of Wellington Wells as Uncle Jack, a beloved figure in every community. Ollie hated him. He vandalized TVs whenever he saw his face, and would often get violent at people who even spoke Jack's name. All of this came to a head when Margaret convinced him to flee to the Garden District. There were no TVs there, after all. Ollie is a violent, unstable, and outright hated figure in Wellington Wells, making his presence in the city dangerous. Hell, he can't even go into the city without being immediately attacked. I don't want this section to be like my Bone Lab video where half of it was just me criticizing the game. So I'll mention the issues here and move on. I might mention them in passing, but I won't make them the main part of the video. Most missions boil down to traveling from point A to B to C and then back to A. It gets really, really repetitive. Each character in the game has an in-game reason for their lack of combat skills, and while that fits narratively, it makes the game a lot more clunky. The fights are slow, sluggish, and the combat is weak. Unlike other open-world games where you learn the map naturally, Fallout New Vegas with the Mojave Wasteland, Breath of the Wild with Hyrule, or Like a Dragon with Yokohama, Wellington Wells is difficult to navigate without constantly checking the map. All of these issues, of course, stem from the game's transition from a more gameplay-focused survival game to a story-driven experience. The map design still feels procedurally generated, despite not being, and it's because of a lack of important areas. Of course, there are still important areas and wonderful set pieces, but they're few and far between. You need to trudge through a sea of boring, dull, repetitive, and sometimes colorful buildings to get to the fun places. The story starts off very simply. You are Arthur Hastings, and you work for the Department of Archives. and you've just come down from a joy-induced high at the sight of the newspaper clipping I mentioned before. It's too much for you. You decide then and there, I'm done with joy, and I'll find my brother, who I sold out and most likely left for dead. This journey is long and grueling, and on it you'll lose most, if not all, of your friends, become a wastrel, and lose everything for the sake of freedom. In order to do this, you need to get out of the Department of Archives. Arthur is a terrible liar, which means he'll be chased out instead of slipping out. Get back into Wellington Wells from the Garden District. Get his hands on a letter of transit, which he needs to jump through a comedically large amount of hoops to get to. Once he gets the letter, he'll need to escape through the train station in the Garden District. But the train station is caved in, so we'll need to get through the mines. He leaves, gives his letter to the constable guarding the bridge, and goes on his merry way. Throughout this journey, you'll get to meet so many memorable NPCs. The doctors, Dr. Faraday, Dr. Verloc, General Bing, etc. You really get to soak in the world here. You get to see what the wellies are doing while on their joy. That cheerful woman skipping in the puddle. Well, when you're off your joy, it's actually a pool of vomit from a sick wastrel. That man enjoying his meal while reading the paper, he's eating a dead rat and washing it down with spit. No other game has managed to capture this aesthetic quite like We Happy Few. That will always be why, despite its overwhelming amount of flaws, I will continue to love this game, no matter what. I'm going to keep this part brief, since I played all the DLCs, but I didn't really soak in what they had, except for the final one. After the game's release, 3 DLCs were released in the following order. Number 1, They Came From Below. This DLC follows Roger and James, Faraday's assistants and lovers, as they embark on an adventure in a facility beneath Faraday's house, where they will encounter and fight alien robot thingies. It's weird. It's the one I paid attention to the least. Lightbearer. The second DLC follows Mr. Nick Lightbearer, this game's version of John Lennon. He wakes up from a hangover in a hotel and needs to piece together what happened the previous night. We all fall down. In this DLC, the player controls Victoria Bing, the daughter of General Bing. After being tied up and having her joy forcibly taken away by Ollie, she realizes just how dire the situation in Wellington Wells truly is. So, she makes it her goal to wake everybody up from Joy's effects. However, once she succeeds, the survivors of her actions lash out at her, forcing her and everybody else to leave the city. Overall, the DLC ranges from, okay, it's fine, to amazing. We All Fall Down is particularly noteworthy, with a lot more vibrant and visually appealing locations. Unlike the main game, it doesn't feel procedurally generated. It feels like they were handcrafted by a team that just loved what they were doing. Lightbearer, while short, has some genuinely creative ideas, which it achieves by embracing Nick's drug-induced hallucinations particularly well. They Came From Below is decent. It's not extraordinary, but it's not bad either. It's nice that you get to see more of Faraday's experiments and more of Roger and James's antics. We Happy Few is an ambitious game with a fascinating world, unique aesthetic, and compelling themes. While it struggles with its repetitive gameplay and lack of map memorability, and its steep and noticeable decline after the first acts, its strength lies in its setting, its storytelling, the eerie contrast between the illusion of happiness and, of course, the grim reality underneath the masks they wear. The DLC adds some interesting expansions to the world. We All Fall Down, of course, being its particularly strongest addition, with its vibrant worlds and further development of specific characters. Despite its flaws, We Happy Few will always, at least to me, remain a memorable experience. It didn't fully live up to its potential, and it was a bit of a letdown from what was advertised, but its unsettling world, haunting themes, and very distinct atmosphere make it a game worth exploring at least once.